Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Coffee with Craig, where we talk about all things firearms, firearms policy, firearms, politics, culture, media, you name it. We're talking about right here on Coffee with Craig. So please take a moment, whether you watch us on YouTube or on Facebook, please take a moment, like and share the program so that your friends can join in the conversation. Also, if you just want to listen to us, you can go to Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Apple iTunes, and you can just listen to the program as well and tell your friends and encourage them to do the same. Also, FBCgear.com, you guys already know, it's the place to go to buy pro-Second Amendment gear. You can find T-shirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, you name it, all stuff to help show your support for the Second Amendment. Know that every dollar that you spend will go right back into the fight for our right to keep and bear arms. So you can support the Second Amendment, and you can look good doing it. That's FBCgear.com. Earlier this month, there was a hearing. Hearing was held, the first quote-unquote gun violence prevention hearing that took place in Congress in quite some time. Now, mind you, as I'm sure you can guess, most of the speakers that were involved in this particular event, well, let's just say they were not necessarily supporters of the Second Amendment. But an interesting thing did come out of it, and that was that not all of the speakers that spoke were necessarily anti-gun. And what was really great about it was that a couple of the speakers in particular that were there were exceptionally powerful. And I just wanted you guys to hear at least a little bit from each one of them so that they can kind of share with you. Now, one thing I do want to note that was noticeable was that there was one person that was missing that I quite frankly, I'm surprised that they found a way in order to keep him out of there. And that would have been, Representative Scalise. You guys might know Representative Scalise. He is Steve Scalise, is the minority whip in the House, and he was one of the individuals. He was one of the congressmen who was playing softball or practicing softball that day when a Bernie Sanders supporter decided that he was going to, commit gun violence upon them. Now, interestingly, you would think that if they had a member of their House who was going to be speaking on it, you would have thought that at least they would have had someone who was a victim of gun violence and a member of their House. You would have thought they would have had him speaking, but no, they didn't. They chose not to because they also know that Mr. Scalise has said time and time again that none of the laws that are being proposed would have prevented the individual, the mad Bernie Sanders supporter from actually doing what it was that he eventually would wind up doing. Now, what you did have is at least one, you had several people who would call themselves constitutional scholars, but one individual was a lady named Joyce Lee. Now, Joyce Lee Malcolm, she is a professor at George Mason University, and she has actually authored a number of different studies that in essence demonstrate why we should support the Second Amendment and why we should oppose unreasonable restrictions on our right to keep and bear arms. And so she had a chance to, have her say with the committee. And here's a small snippet of it.
Explained in two landmark cases that the framers of the Second Amendment were clear about the solution to public safety. They bequeathed to us as individuals the right to keep and bear those guns in common use for self-defense and other lawful purposes. In other words, we are to have the means to protect ourselves. And I should say about those two cases, one, the Heller case in Washington and the McDonald case in Chicago, that the petitioners were people who really needed to protect themselves. One of the ones in the Heller case was a woman named Shelley Parker, who lived in Washington where there was a lot of drug dealing going on. She reported this several times to the police, and the drug dealers said they knew who she was and they were going to get her. In Chicago, Otis McDonald was an African-American in his 70s. His apartment had been invaded several times, and he needed something to protect himself. So these cases were brought by people who really needed to protect themselves. Now, there's some people that argue that this right of the Second Amendment is outdated. We have police to protect us, and go on to claim that permitting law-abiding citizens to have firearms to protect themselves would make all of us less safe. Do we still need to protect ourselves? Well, first, however responsible the police are, they cannot protect all of us all of the time. And in fact, in a landmark case here in Washington, we found out that they had no responsibility to protect any individual. There was a case brought by 3 women who were assaulted in their townhouse in Capitol Hill. They called 911 repeatedly for half an hour. Nobody ever came. They sued the police in Washington, and the court dismissed their case, saying that there was a duty to provide public service to the public at large, but absent a special relationship between the police and an individual, no specific legal duty exists. In short, the police have no legal duty to protect any one of us.
Yeah, see now, there were 3 very significant nuggets that I thought were important to kind of pick up on there. Once again, well, actually 4. One was just the idea that in both Heller and McDonald, that look, it specifically they specifically noted that you have an individual right to keep and bear arms for self-defense. And the interesting thing, that the real good nuggets about it was that she pointed out 2 of the people. One of them was one of the plaintiffs in Heller, who was a female, a woman who simply wanted to be able to defend herself against drug dealers who had already threatened her. Now, if you're in D.C. and you're being threatened by drug dealers, if that is not reason enough to allow someone to be able to defend themselves, I don't know what is. But then even further, you go to Otis McDonald. Now, Otis McDonald survived the civil rights movement in the South and moved to Chicago. And then while in Chicago, basically encountered gangs and drugs and needed to be able to defend himself. Once again, just wanted to defend himself in his own home, in his own community. And was told by the city of Chicago that he didn't have that right. And once again, as people say, well, you don't need that. You don't need that because the police will protect you. We've already seen once again, that's the other nugget that she shared, was the fact that the courts have already ruled that there is no constitutional duty for law enforcement to protect us. So if there's no duty for law enforcement to protect us, there's no requirement for law enforcement to protect us, how can we then not be able to exercise our constitutionally enumerated right to be able to protect and defend ourselves? Now, as we talk, most of these laws are not that they're these anti-gun laws that they're proposing will do absolutely nothing to keep criminals from committing gun violence and from committing violent acts. All they do is make victims out of law-abiding citizens. Well, victims like this next speaker. You guys, this is Savannah Lindquist, right? Well, I'll tell you what. I will let you guys have probably already heard about her, but I'm going to let you hear her experience. What happened to her because of gun control?
So before you went away to college, you'd been using and been trained in using a gun for many years.
Yes, sir.
When you went to college, you left home?
I did. I moved to Philadelphia from Norfolk, Virginia.
Okay. And did you take any guns with you?
I did not. It would have been illegal for me to have it on my college campus. And even transporting it could have been an issue because I couldn't obviously drive it through Maryland given their firearm laws. But no, I didn't want to break the law, so I left it at home.
So you made a statement in your written testimony that you said, I obeyed the law as a responsible gun owner and it ended with me being raped. I'm just one of countless examples of gun control benefiting assailants and making victims sitting ducks. I wonder if you would expand on that and tell us what you mean by that.
Sure. So in my situation personally, I was left defenseless. There was nothing I could have done. He snuck up behind me and he attacked me, and I'm just a young woman, and at the time I weighed 100 pounds less than I do now, so there was no fighting him off. So that's what I mean in terms of my situation. But there are a lot of examples. Like one of the top ones that comes to my mind is Nikki Gozer, who there was a law at the time where you couldn't have your you couldn't bring a firearm into a restaurant. And so she, as a law-abiding citizen, left it in the car, and her husband was shot and murdered in the restaurant, and she couldn't defend him.
So here is an individual who had years of experience and training with firearms, could not have a firearm on a college campus, and as a result was put in a situation where she could not defend herself from an attacker, from a rapist. And so she was raped because she was not in a position where she was able to defend herself. And she shared the example of another individual who was not able to take their firearm, even though they had a concealed carry permit, into a restaurant. And as a result, that place was robbed and her husband was shot and killed. So this is, once again, this is a victim, a person who's been victimized by gun violence. I mean, not by gun violence, but victimized by gun control. Has been victimized by gun control because, once again, you know, the person robbing the restaurant didn't care that you weren't supposed to take a gun into the restaurant. They did it anyway. The rapist didn't care, well, hey, you know, she wasn't supposed to bring a gun, so she didn't, well, I guess they cared in that it made her a potential victim. If she had been able to have a firearm, she would have been able to defend herself and would not have been raped. You know, and I keep hearing people use these examples saying, well, but what if the attacker is able to get your gun? And, you know, the interesting thing is you almost never, ever, ever hear of that happening. More often you hear about individuals who are attacked being able to utilize that firearm to defend themselves. Now, setting aside, these were just two of the people who testified, and we know that the overwhelming majority of the people who testified in this particular hearing, well, we just know that they were anti-gun. We know that their goal is to achieve this false sense of security and feeling safe. But we know that they'll never actually achieve it because we know that this policy, this legislation will not do that. Now, granted, they did this hearing, and chances are all of these anti-gun proposals that they're proposing are going to be heard in the House. Chances are they'll pass the House. But we do know that once they hit the Senate, they're going to run into a serious roadblock. But folks, don't be lulled to sleep. There's another election coming up in a couple of years. And that doesn't mean that, and included in that election is a presidential election. That means that not only is the Senate going to be up for grabs, the House is going to continue to be up for grabs, as well as the White House is going to be up for grabs. And these are people who are running. These are people who are right now who are running the House, whose number one goal is to make sure that you are disarmed, to make sure that your right to be able to defend yourself from criminals as well as from their totalitarian government. Yeah, they want to make sure that you are in a position where you are not able to do so. But, you know, once again, it's refreshing. Here in California, we have to kind of accept the same thing. It's like, it's refreshing when you get a chance to hear sound voices of logic and reason amongst all of the muck and the mire and the crap that you hear coming from these particular types of hearings. These are voices that everyday Americans that we need to hear. We need to make sure that we're sharing their voices, their messages, so that everybody can really come to understand why it's so important that we support the Second Amendment. Yes, it is about our constitutional right. We have a right to own firearms that are safe and in common use. It is about self-defense and our right, our fundamental human right to be able to defend ourselves from all enemies, foreign and domestic, up to and including a tyrannical government. And that's the biggest thing. The biggest thing is the Second Amendment was written so that we could defend ourselves from an out-of-control government that seeks to force tyranny upon us. And more, we're seeing state governments, local governments, more and more, we're seeing not just Democrats, but even Republicans who are okay with state-sponsored tyranny, all in the name of this perceived safety or feeling of safeness that they think that they're going to achieve through these particular policies. But I think you and I, we know that that's a bunch of poppycock. Anyway, folks, that's going to be it for today's Coffee with Craig. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for liking and sharing this program and telling your friends about the Firearms Policy Coalition. We are the home in the fight for civil rights. Got to use them or you're going to lose them. You guys take care.
If you like our videos, follow, subscribe, like, and share.